being a match manager and being given a call over the PA, would I go to the players' tunnel at tea on the third day of the Test match against the West Indies. Now, I'd been sitting with Anita and my two children and a few other people, and being called to go to the tunnel was very unusual. So when I got there, Bruce Edgar was sitting on a big Coke machine.
In the dressing room area is, unquote, an umpire's strike. Now, it sounds amazing, but the time is 4:10. Fred Goodall and Steve Woodward are out there, but it's just unbelievable.
I turned down a couple of faint caught behinds off the glove, as it turned out. The New Zealand captain Howard, and the West Indies didn't accept this, and at one stage halfway through the match they threatened to walk out. They didn't come out after tea one time.
And he said to me, "Brian, the West Indies are not coming out after tea. You better go into the room and see what's going on." And I said, "Well, I don't think I'm quite the person to do that." So I'm talking to Bruce. Coney and Howell threw up in the stand. They were the two not-out batsmen. Yeah. And fortunately, Bob Vance and Walter Hagley arrived just at that moment where I was about to knock on the door. And they went in, and they were in there for about 10 or 12 minutes. Right. That was the whole break. Yeah. And they came out, and of course the next day, unfortunately, was a reserve day. Yeah. And there was a lot of phone calls with John Knowles, and who was chairman at that time, and Jeff Stolmeyer, who was in the West Indies in Jamaica. Yeah. And they went out, and of course the last day, the fourth day, was the terrible day when Croft barged Fred Goodall. Fred Goodall, yeah.
Croft to Hagley. No ball called, wide down the leg side. Croft's 11th no ball. New Zealand move on to 325. Things getting a little heated here. Colin Croft. Baiting umpire Fred Goodall, and the crowd responding with a little abuse for Colin Croft. Well, he hit umpire Fred Goodall on his run-up. He ran deliberately close to umpire Goodall. Colin Croft moving in to bowl to Richard Hadley after we'd seen Richard Hadley talking to Croft. He ran very close to Fred Goodall and in fact struck him on his way through to bowl. A deliberate action, obviously.
They would not talk to me. They wouldn't accept my decisions, and certain comments were made. It's quite interesting, really, some of the comments. And after I called Colin for a no ball and turned down the court behind, that was too much for him, so he came in and ran into me. But the ball immediately before that, when I had called him for a no ball, he flicked the bails off in front of me as a gesture of defiance, perhaps. Who knows? And after the incident, when I got hit, I walked down the pitch to Clive Lloyd, the captain, but he didn't really want to know about it.
Unfortunate incident. One can only wonder where we go from here.
And when that happened, I was in the match room where we were watching the game, and it was where number 2 stand was. Yeah. We were in there running the match. Yeah. And Billy Abdallah, who was cricket commentating, came running down in a high dudgeon saying, "Brian, you've got to go out in the field there and bring that man off the field because you're the match manager. You can't have that sort of thing happening." Billy was so upset. Yeah. I said, "I think that's not going to happen, Billy." I'd got to know him quite well because we had been managers of underage teams. Right. He looked after the Otago side. So I calmed him down walked back with him to the commentator's box, and he was still muttering.
Yeah.
But that was a terrible,
Yes.
terrible day of cricket.
Yes, it was.
Terrible day.
That was a bad tour.
Bad day. But it still riles me that sort of behaviour carried on.
Yeah.
Because you remember how Fred Goodall had to walk all the way down to the slips
Yeah.
and talk to Clive Law,
Yes.
who was at third slip,
He wouldn't come up.
and he just folded his arms
Yeah.
and didn't say a thing.
Unfortunate incident. One can only wonder where we go from here.
But do you remember Fred Goodall? He umpired club cricket.
Oh yeah, I remember him vividly.
Well, I remember we used to walk out on
Coming
the
home a
field.
lot.
We'd say to him, because he didn't want to speak at all,
No,
we'd
he
walk out
wouldn't.
on the field and say, "Morning, Fred,
Yeah.
morning, Fred,"
Yeah.
and he'd walk straight ahead and not say a word.
That's right.
And the game I really do remember was Peter Sharp was bowling beautifully, and he couldn't get an LB decision off Fred.
No.
And I was keeping, we were peeling, and eventually he was like, see, he was getting very frustrated, and I said to Peter at the end, I said, well, don't worry, you're bound to get a wicket soon. And he turned to me and said, well, I won't get a wicket in this bloody city because they're all blind.
Mm.
And Fred hadn't moved from the wickets. And Fred turned around and said, what did you say, Sharp?
Yeah.
And Peter said to me, look, they're not only blind, but they're deaf as well.
Let's get back to some administration. And, so, Lancaster Park Board of Control, New Zealand Cricket Council. At a Canterbury level, you were also tasked with doing various reports, and I mean the Adams report is quite famous, and we in Metro Cricket still refer to what's called the Adams report, which was looking at where the growth of cricket would be in the next X number of 30, 40 years, and where we should be looking to amalgamate clubs or move clubs to, and so on, in a perfect world. One of the other papers you looked at was to do with, it looked like an international venue where the major venue in Christchurch might go. So what were some of the areas you looked at? I mean, given where we are now at Hagley Oval, this beautiful world-class ground, which have been embellished now with lights as we look out, so it's going to expand its ability to provide cricket around the world. Where in Christchurch did you look when you were doing that?
I was president at the time, and the board had a meeting on a Sunday to discuss a number of issues. It was chaired by Chris Dorwick,
Yes.
who was the CEO of New Zealand
Yeah.
Cricket. And there were four things like finance was one, and the other thing was a ground for Canterbury, because we had been using the village green,
Yes.
and it really wasn't particularly good.
The village green being down at Brighton.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
And where the stand was, you opened to the easterly wind.
Mm.
And first, when they went there, first of all, they had to use tents and use porta
Yes.
I mean, it was awful. It was done bush by Tony Murdoch and
Yes.
Morris Ryan at the time. So they said, well, what are we going to do about a new venue? And someone said, well, we needed some options. And I just retired,
Mm.
and they looked at me and said, well,
He's a man.
you've written those other reports
Yes.
on club cricket, would you do this one? And I said, yes, okay, because I retired, I had a
Yes.
bit more time on my hands.
Yeah.
So what I did for about 6, 8 weeks, drove around the city, around the outskirts, spoke to a number of people, what their views were, and I came down to about 6 options, I think it was. One was, in fact, probably the first one I looked at was the A&P ground,
Yep.
just off Curtis Road.
Yeah.
And I took the board out there on a Sunday afternoon in the car, and I drove around and I showed them this area, which is only used for car parking, when the show's on. I spoke to Dougal Thomas, who was in charge of the ground, and I said, what would happen if we had a cricket ground here? He said, well, it's not a problem. The only problem is when there's car parking required. But I said, why can't you use some of the area towards the school that's down there going towards the west? And he said, that's a possibility too. So I went and wrote it all up on that basis, is that what is the top one. I looked at the netball centre where the netball is that a possibility? I also looked at the literature and went through the negative parts there. Hagley Oval, I got a report from Galloway's legal firm by Tim Sinclair. It said, don't go near Hagley because it'll be impossible to get. You'll have the management. There's two acts of parliament that you have to get past to get anything at Hagley. And of course it'll be very difficult to get past. Everybody loves the park as it is. So I wiped it out. Didn't do Hagley Oval at all. So I keep pursuing the option at the AMP ground. We got Michael Braithwaite's surveying firm to do a whole analysis of the pros and cons of that one, like traffic design, how it would be with the drainage, that sort of thing. And I presented it to the board, and we decided we would still keep Addington as an option too. I've spoken to the people, the rugby league people there, and both rugby stands were due for demolition. And so we had the two options in front of us. One was the AMP ground, and the other one was the ground at Addington, the league ground. So we decided on the AMP ground, and Richard Reid had made a presentation to the AMP board. Peter Townsend was a member of the AMP board, and he was also the CEO of the Chamber of Commerce. So we talked it through at the board, and they said they'll go away and think about it. So about 4 or 5 weeks later, we had a meeting in the City Council chambers. There was Bob Parker, the CEO of the City Council at the time. There was Peter Townsend and somebody else from the AMP board. There was myself and Cran, and Lee Geelong had just arrived in the city to take up his job. And Doug Marsh was the other one from the AMP board. And Doug Marsh got up and said that the AMP board had discussed running some land for Canterbury cricket, but with the difficulty they're going to experience with having the new motorway coming through, they were unsure how much land they would use. So we are not prepared to give you that land, but we'll provide land further west near that college, Hallsville Colleges. So we went away, they went away, Doug Marsh and Peter Townsend left the room, and Bob Parker turned to Craven and said, well, that's not an option. What is the best place to have cricket in Christchurch? And Craven said Hagley Oval. Well, for the next 10 minutes, Bob fused about the whole concept. He said, that's a fantastic idea. It'll be televised and people around the world will see Hagley Oval. It'll be great for visitors to come here and know what they have an option. It'll be fantastic. Oh no, go ahead. We'll sort Hagley Oval out. And that was the beginning.
Beginning of it,
And
that's right.
Lee was listening to this and he didn't know the negatives about Hagley Oval.
No.
So he got involved. And I did the initial work with Lee in terms of having it here, talking to St Albans and Riccarton clubs who would be affected of having the main oval here, one ground. And the initial concept was just to have a embankment only 2/3 of the way round. The idea was over in that direction down there that the Riccarton Pavilion would be the other ground of the pitch. And so the club cricket would still be able to play here. They can have the lone oval from time to time and still have the third pitch in front of Riccarton. So the earthquake happened 2 years later, 2013. And we realised then that Leinster Park was never going to be used again. We had based the 2/3 on the fact that we could have 50 over or T20 cricket at Leinster Park. And so it was only being designed purely as a first class and test arena, in which we're looking at about 6,000 people. So having lost Leinster Park, the whole concept had to be rethought again. And Trevor Watt, who was doing the architect from Athfields, came up with the idea. He designed the pavilion here and he designed the embankment. So that's how Hagley Oval
Yeah.
was developed.
Yeah. So
But it was also, it was only when I think I did the 13 pitches and having 70 metre boundaries, you suddenly realise you need about 220 metres sideways and lengthwise.
That's right.
And we've been working on far less than that.
Here, I mean, it's highly successful, and they've developed Hagley with the club cricket on sort of the outer grounds. It's a on a Saturday with cricket here. There's a lovely vista of cricket in Christchurch.
It wasn't easy though, because we had to go through the environment course.
Yes. You've been a fantastic and still are with Canterbury Cricket, sort of like their historian, and you've produced some of the photographs we've got here would have come out of your folios and portfolios, and throughout Canterbury Cricket Building, if you go and have a look there. I sort of picked up the very end of your work on that and sort of got them framed and stuff, but you handed over a huge number of photographs of player profiles and detail on that. What sort of got you interested in that?
It started from 83, 84 when
Right.
I managed the Canterbury side,
Right.
and Paul had his great year of 750 runs, and nobody really knew whether that was a record or not.
Right.
So I thought, well, this is crazy. So that started me on finding that sort of thing, and I just kept delving. And then when I finished, I went through everybody who played first class cricket, innings by innings, which I don't think anybody's seen that. Other than that, I mean, normally you just get an analysis of each year, but when you do innings by innings, that was a new way of doing it, and I enjoyed it that, but it took a long time. It probably took about 7 or 8 years to do all those people. So when I finished that, I thought, well, what's their background like? You know, what were they like? What sort of jobs did they have? What school did they go to? So I started again on the first one, who played cricket. The first 2 people who played cricket. One was a Wilson and one was Powell. And the Wilson fella drowned. His father was one of the judges here in Christchurch, and he drowned pushing cattle, moving cattle from one side of the Rakaia River to the other. And I read the coroner's report and I thought, well, that was sad. And then the other one was killed. He was a farmer who'd come to New Zealand a couple of times. I'm talking about 1870s, 1880. And he decided to go and live in Argentina and farm there. But he was killed by a bunch of the Indians who didn't like what he was doing. So I thought, well, those 2 actually had quite interesting lives. So then I started going through all the early ones, and I wanted their photographs, their portraits, and also what school they'd been to. And of course the early ones had all been to mostly public schools, and so that was easy to find. But later on it became more difficult when I finished that, and one of the last ones I did was a fellow called Alan Burgess, who was his father was Tom Burgess, who was a New Zealand umpire and umpired the very first test match in Christchurch in 1930. And I looked in the phone book to find Alan Burgess, and sure enough, there he was, A.T. Burgess, living in Rangiora. He was about 90 at the time. And I rang him and I said, oh, Alan, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And he did. He was thoroughly enjoyed talking to me. And I said, Alan, I noticed that your father was the umpire in the first match you had on your debut. And he said, yeah, that was right. And I said, the first one you got was an LBW. He said, that's right, Brian, it was. I said, was he umpiring at your end? And he said, yes, he was. I said, well, how did that happen, Alan? What's the story? And he said, well, I never turned the ball much, but I used to bowl balls that would come into the batsman. And I turned around and I said, how's that, Dad? Surely, by logic, he said, I don't know what happened. But Dad, Tom put up his hand, well bowled, son, he's out.
Yes, yeah.
I said to him, that's not true, Alan, is it? He said, well, Brian, everybody else has died in the team, so you'll have to believe me.
Yeah.
He was good human and he enjoyed talking cricket.
Yeah, yeah.
But one thing I didn't realise at the time was that he actually was a member of the Commonwealth cricket team that stayed in England after the war.
Yeah, that's right.
And they played at Lord's and the Oval. And he said that was a great experience because it was a very strong side. I don't think Keith Miller was in it, and Lindsay Hassett, those sort of people.
Yes.
and a thoroughly good experience
Yeah.
from before he came back to New Zealand.